Hello, everyone. My name is Robert Winfree, and what you're about to listen to is an old episode of a podcast I used to host called Everyone Loves a Bad Guy. This particular episode features myself, and after a few minutes, he calls in Gavin Napier, the time of the casual heroes, and the two of us have a discussion about Breaking Bad, which had just wrapped up. The original air date for this was August 29th, 2014, so in the vicinity of that. I think part of what spurred me for this was the Emmys that year had recently happened. So, synergy, right? But Breaking Bad it's a personal favorite show, and there's a lot of nuance, there's a lot of tremendous acting, very good writing, and it's a show that is just chock full of compelling villainous characters. So, of course, it was going to get a full Everyone Loves a Bad Guy treatment. There's a lot to discuss. Because of how I edit these down, they're not as long as they are in their original format. Truncate silence is a heck of a thing. But there's a lot to talk about in this one, and a pretty good discussion to be had between myself and Gavin. So thank you all very much for listening. Anything you can do to support the show and the network, wherever you're listening to this, please subscribe. We are very grateful for all the help you can give us. Thank you. With that out of the way, let me throw it to my past self, and I hope you all enjoy the show.
When the devil is too busy and death a bit too much, they call on me by name, you see, for my special touch. To the gentlemen, I'm misfortune. To the ladies, I'm surprise. But call me by any name, anyway, it's all the same. I'm the fly in your suit, I'm the pest in your shoe, I'm the bee beneath your bed, I'm the bump on every head, I'm the heel on which you slip, I'm the pin in every head, I'm the thorn in your side, makes you wriggle and writhe, and it's so easy when you're evil. This is the life you see, the devil tips his hat to me, I do it all because I'm evil, and I do it all for free. Your tears are all the pay I'll ever need.
All right, everyone. Hello, and thank you so very much for choosing to listen to this podcast. This is Everyone Loves a Bad Guy, your weekly dose of villainy. I am your host, Robert Winfree, and if you're listening live, thank you. I wound up pushing the start time back half an hour. If you're listening to the recorded version, you obviously don't care. I'm just glad you chose this podcast. I know you got a bunch of choice. All right, before we dive into tonight's topic, I have a couple of housekeeping things to do. You see, I mentioned last week that I was still going to be continuing my journey through professional wrestling villains this week. That was the plan last week. Then, I did a little look at some of the scheduling, some of the timing, and I was reminded of a few things, courtesy of other podcasts. First of all, next Friday there will not be a show. I will be covering UFC Fight Night 50, headlined by Ronaldo Jacare Souza taking on Gegard, the Dreamcatcher Mousasi. It comes to you from Brazil, but it comes to you Friday evening, which is when I would normally be doing this, but since I'll be covering that, I won't be doing this. And I didn't feel like breaking up all the... I also felt like I was in a good spot to take a pause in my journey through professional wrestling, because last time Mark Radlich and I talked about some of the great guys from the Attitude Era. A lot of fun there. And my next two shows are going to be WCW from Jim Crockett Promotions, essentially that loose kind of confederation through its eventual demise. And then Extreme Championship Wrestling, ECW. And then that was going to lead us into what the WWE has done over the last 10 years or so, give or take. And a little bit of TNA probably. I might put that off a few more weeks just so I can celebrate their Spike deal not being renewed again. I don't know. I don't hate the promotion. It would be a fun bit of timing. Anyway, the point being, a good enough spot to pause for a couple of weeks, and it was reminded to me, brought back to my attention that I had yet to talk about Breaking Bad on this show. Now, for those of you who remember the 5th season of Breaking Bad, the final season, if you were following my show at the time, and I thank you for that, I really do, but at the time every week I had a schedule mapped out where I talked about a great television villain or a great television show every week up until the final episode. Immediately following the series finale of Breaking Bad, myself, Mark Radulich, and Robert Cooper hopped on to a Google Hangout, and we talked about it, and it was all fun, and it was fine and dandy. But I had not yet discussed that show on my show. And given how much I love Breaking Bad, it was an error I had to rectify, and fun little bit of further fortuitous timing. This last Monday was the Primetime Emmys, with Breaking Bad winning all of the awards it deserved to win. I believe there were 5. So I figure the timing won't be better. I'm going to be off next week. The Emmys just happened, all that good stuff. So here we are, and we're going to be discussing Breaking Bad. So if you're a fan of the series, if you have something you want to say, a favorite episode, a favorite moment, want to call in, I'll go ahead and make this a call-in show for the... just if you want to call in and have a few things to say. I'm expecting Gavin Napier of the Casual Heroes to be on in the near future. He expressed interest and is kind of the reason that I decided to do this, because on the Whiskey Rebellion this week he mentioned that he asked if I had talked about Breaking Bad on this show and expressed his interest, so I expect him to be calling in. He's going to be hanging out with me for the duration. But anyone else, if you just have like a favorite episode, again, a favorite moment, something along those lines, the call-in number is 323-657-0901. If you want to use the Skype machine, you've got to be looking at the Blog Talk Radio page. You click the Skype icon about the dead set middle on top of the player, and click through some dialog boxes. It brings you on here. And that will get you on here, and I'll do my darndest to get you on the air. All right, let's go ahead and jump into this. Breaking Bad. Good grief. I mentioned before, this is one of my favorite television shows ever. Not quite my absolute favorite. I think there are some thematic things that maybe The Wire does better, and given my love of zombies, I can't discount The Walking Dead a few weak seasons, notwithstanding, and all that fun stuff. But I loved everything about Breaking Bad, essentially from start to finish. This was just a masterful show, and I have to mention right away, first of all, I can't say enough good things about Bryan Cranston. The man deserved every award he was nominated for, every award he won. His portrayal of Walter White is probably the single most compelling bit of character acting on television in the last decade. I think the only things that potentially, and there's Abby the Wonder Beagle, who wishes to be heard on the podcast again. The only characters that come close to Walter White are, I say this one begrudgingly because I wasn't a huge fan, but that can't overlook, but Hugh Laurie is Greg House. And if you want to go back further, the other one that the comparison that I think is a bit more apt maybe would be the late, great James Gandolfini as Tony Soprano. But, I mean, for so much of it, Bryan Cranston just has redefined, and we're living in a kind of a golden age of television. Movies nowadays are not actually stories. They follow a loose structure, but they tend to be roller coaster rides. If you listen to Mark Radulich, and you should, by the way, he talks about this from time to time with certain movies. They're just roller coasters, they're thrill rides. They just have to be big with a loose story instead of necessarily something that is character-driven or very plot-driven, all that fun stuff. But those stories, those character-driven, those subtle kinds of stories that are told are now being told on television, where you get, 3, 4, 5 seasons to let a character breathe, let a story develop, watch a character's arc. Too many times we get characters and television shows that don't have a defined arc in mind, but we pretty much did for Breaking Bad, and it absolutely benefits from it. But at the Emmys this particular year, Breaking Bad won Best Primetime Drama. Bryan Cranston won for Best Actor in a Dramatic Series. Aaron Paul won for Jesse Pinkman, Best Supporting Actor. Anna Gunn won for Best Supporting Actress. I think one of the director is either a director or writer. Might have been a writer, one of the writing ones that won the fifth one. For me, if you have the best show, it stands to reason it's the best directed. Those two awards should kind of go hand in hand, and that goes for the Oscars as well. By the way, Saving Private Ryan was worlds better than Shakespeare in Love, and Steven Spielberg won the Oscar for Best Director. Didn't win Best Picture. Ugh, decisions. All right. Okay, I think this is Gavin Napier of the Casual Heroes who's going to be hopping on right now. I don't have anything to kill time with. So, area code 304. You're Gavin, right?
Yes, I am.
Yay, I guessed correctly. All right.
Well done.
Yay, me. All right, everybody. If you listen to my show on Green Lantern, Gavin Napier made an appearance there because he's a big fan of that comic book series. But he wanted to come back for this one. He mentioned he's a huge fan of Breaking Bad. I'm very grateful that you could find the time to be on my show, Gavin. Thank you.
Not a problem. It's a slow Friday evening here in West Virginia, so why not talk about what I feel is the greatest show of all time?
I wouldn't disagree with you too much there. Now, to kind of jump into this, Bryan Cranston, I almost resisted watching this show just because my only association with Bryan Cranston was with Hal from Malcolm in the Middle. Now, granted, he was hands down the best thing about that, generally speaking, terrible show. I mean, for him to go from Hal, that kind of goofball, to being Heisenberg and to be so believable in it, that's a depth of talent that you don't see all that.
Yeah, one of the benefits to my schedule and TV watching and movie watching is I currently do not and have not had cable for the better part of 8 years. The only time that I have had cable in that time frame is when my father was living with me. Well, not living with me. He stayed with me for a period of a few weeks while he was receiving radiation and chemotherapy. And since he was going to be at my apartment while I was working throughout the day, I had cable hooked up so he would have something to watch and occupy himself with. Other than that, I haven't had cable for the last 7 or 8 years. So I didn't see Malcolm in it. I had no knowledge of it because when I did have cable, my viewing schedule was reduced to a handful of things. I watched Braves baseball. I watched NFL and college football. I watched Sports Center. I watched Adult Swim. I made it a point to watch House, NCIS, and CSI New York, and that was about it. And if you think back to where television was a decade ago, there wasn't a whole lot else going on, really. So that was my complete viewing schedule. So I really didn't have any knowledge of Bryan Cranston or his work on Malcolm in the Middle going into Breaking Bad. I just knew what the general public reaction to his casting as what we knew would soon be a mess cook to be. And the reaction was a little bit surprising. People seemed very taken aback by it, and that's all I had to go on. And so I went into Breaking Bad with pretty much a complete blank slate on Bryan Cranston, and I don't know if it's more or less amazing what he was able to do, because even with no prior knowledge of him as an actor or any other character work that he's done, I think Walter White is probably the most layered and engaging character in television history.
Yeah, I mentioned this, I don't know if you heard when I was talking about this, but the only two individual characters that come close would be Greg House and Tony Soprano, and I firmly believe that Walter White has surpassed them, and that's not a knock on them. It's more a testament to the writing and the acting that went into that went into Heisenberg.
Right. Yeah, I love House. I haven't seen The Sopranos. It's one of those shows that I need to go back and watch at some point. I'm very bitter at HBO because they cancel all of the shows I like very quickly. Deadwood, Carnival, and Lucky Louie all died quick deaths on HBO, so I'm a little bit bitter and resentful towards their shows that are successful and tend not to watch them out of spite.
You have the same relationship with HBO that a lot of people do with Fox.
Yeah.
All right, so this is such an interesting character arc for Walter White, who starts out as this kind of henpecked, down on his luck a little bit, going through life, high school chemistry teacher, which has to be one of the worst jobs in the world. I mean, of all the subjects to teach in high school, there are a few that I have to imagine just are worse than others. And chemistry has to be kind of near the top of that list. I imagine you get maybe 3 people out of an entire year that are actually interested in chemistry. Everyone else is just kind of there. So he's got a job. He's a brilliant chemist, but he's been reduced to this. His life is just not in a good spot. And then to top it all off, you've got serious lung cancer. And he goes a little crazy, but what I found so fascinating was the more we got to know Walter White, the more you kind of realized everything he did as Heisenberg, none of it was actually because of the cancer. That was an excuse, good one in some cases. But all of that stuff it existed within him prior to that. He just did not have any excuse or any outlet for it. There's no great, I hate to say transformation in the sense that, he doesn't start off as an altar boy and wind up as a meth dealer. Everything he does kind of comes from within, and then, of course, from without, as his life spirals more and more out of control, like it does when you try to become the biggest methamphetamine distributor in the southwestern United States.
Yeah, it was an interesting progression, to say the very least. And you mentioned that the cancer became the excuse or the gateway for him to allow these things to come out. We've seen similar character traits across various mediums. For Bruce Banner, it's anger. It allows the Hulk to take over, and it allows all of Bruce Banner's emotions to come out unfiltered, and he can do whatever he wants because nothing can stop the Hulk. We saw it with Michael Douglas in Falling Down, where a man had nothing left to lose, and he simply had a psychological break. And then we see in Breaking Bad, we see this man, Walter White, who has spent his entire adult life sacrificing what he thinks is for the greater good for his family and for his morals and for his principles. And he sort of becomes this textbook case of this man who's just holding everything inside in order to maintain the appearance and reputation that people expect from him. And all of a sudden, with this diagnosis, he has a way out. He has an outlet. He has a way to start living for himself that no one can blame him for. And it leads to just an incredible metamorphosis over the next 5 seasons.
I mean, some of my favorite moments kind of along his path come from the first season. I mean, when he loses it at the owner of the car wash that he works at, his diatribe about him and his eyebrows is hilarious.
Yeah.
And it's extremely cathartic as well to anyone who's ever worked for a guy like that. Not that his boss was a bad guy, but if you've ever been in a menial job and had a boss kind of like that, there's nothing you wanted to do more than precisely what Bryan Cranston. And then probably one of my favorite moments of the first 2 seasons, because I think 3, 4, and then both the way they split up 5 are kind of different animals too, for a lot of reasons. But when he sees that guy with the red convertible who's just deeply inconsiderate and always on his cell phone, and his response at the gas station is to pop his hood and drop the windshield squeegee between the poles of his car battery and then let it explode. I stood up and cheered. I thought it was awesome because we all know people like that. And we've all seen someone like that. And it's harmless, functionally harmless to do what he did, especially compared with, running over a couple of guys and then shooting one of them in the head.
Right. And in the moment, for what it is, doing something like letting a douchebag's car catch on fire and explode at a gas station because he's incredibly rude and inconsiderate. In that small window, the first time you see it with the limited frame of reference you have for Walter White, it is this very cathartic moment that paints Walter White as this guy who simply had enough. He really doesn't have anything left to lose given the limited lifespan that's facing him. And so he does something that we all dream about doing. It's borderline heroic. And then as you see the arc progress and you're able to step back and take a look at who Walter White is and who he ultimately becomes, there's not so much heroic about it as it is a window into the darkness that lives inside of him and a foreshadowing of what he's going to become, this very remorseless human being that has his very unique set of morals. And the duality of situations like that, where on one hand, in the moment, it is very heroic, and on the other hand, it's a snapshot of who the character is at heart. I think that's one of the most fascinating things about this show, because Walter White and Heisenberg are very much 2 different people living in the same body.
Yeah, that leads to, I wish I couldn't find the sound clip and get it downloaded. I tried finding it, but after 12 pages of industrial/electric music inspired by the phrase, "I am the one who knocks," I gave up hope. But that scene where he's talking with Skylar, his wife, and he goes from just being essentially Walter White to when she questions him about, needing to be protected, he transforms into Heisenberg before you when he gives that great bit about, who do you think you're talking to right now? You think I answer the door? No, I'm the one who knocks. And it's fascinating to watch him go in that space from one to the other. I mean, it's the same guy, but the transformation, and it's all subtle stuff. I mean, it's just in his face and his eyes and his mannerisms. But if you wanted to show, I mean, again, just one guy going from mild-mannered high school teacher to meth kingpin in the space of, a minute and a half's worth of dialogue, it's absolutely brilliant.
Yeah, I know when playing Superman, Christopher Reeves made a very plain distinction between playing Superman and playing Clark Kent. And you can look at him, you can listen to interviews and documentaries on the film where he talks about when he played the Clark Kent role, he would adjust his posture, he would slump over a little bit, and he would affect his speech a little bit more to become a little bit more marble-mouthed, and he would accentuate certain movements to make himself look clumsy and jerky. And then when he plays Superman, when he embraces that role, the chest sticks out, he stands up very straight, he speaks with this very clear baritone voice, there's no meekness to him. And so we see some of that character acting with the scene you're talking about in particular, but you can look throughout the show again. You have these snapshots of who Heisenberg and Walter White is, who they are, and then you can step back and you can see it played out across the larger frame of reference, because in the classroom as Walter White, when dealing with Skylar, when dealing with Walt Jr., you see a completely different set of body language than you do when Heisenberg is dealing with Gus Fring, or when he's screaming at Jesse, or, any time that he is addressing Skylar as the one who knocks. And so, great acting from Bryan Cranston here, because the metamorphosis, it's not just a psychological thing. It's a very real thing. His body movement, his tone of voice, it's brilliant to watch from an acting standpoint.
I also have to, this is just me, mind you, and I don't know where you fall on this particular spectrum, but I like watching, he doesn't do it very often, but I have to credit Bryan Cranston for knowing how to shoot a firearm. He doesn't, I think there's a grand total of 3 times he actually does it in the whole show. He shoots one of Fring's lieutenants when they were trying to kill Jesse. He runs both of them over with his car, shoots the one that's still alive in the head, and then at the end when he shoots the neo-Nazi leader. But just posture, knowing how to properly aim and fire a weapon without looking like a complete buffoon. I grew up around firearms, so when I see someone do something stupid with them, it tends to bother me. And thankfully, I mean, he fumbled a bit when he bought the 38. They actually made a great deal of him trying to figure out how to, properly draw, fire, be aware of the weapon, but towards the rest of the season, anytime he's handling it, it looks natural. And to the same point, the guy who played Mike Ehrmantraut, I should remember his name, but I don't off the top of my head. As a former, again, the character's a former police officer, whatever he's doing, he looks completely natural. And it's, again, little things like that add to the overall experience that I just have to thank the entire cast for. But you mentioned the interactions between Jesse, Aaron Paul, Jesse Pinkman, and Walter White. Jesse became kind of an underground hero for his random exclamations, and I don't mean his copious use of the word bitch. I mean, one of my favorites is when they're trying to figure out how to wipe Fring's computer while it's inside the DEA storage lockup, and they create a giant electromagnet, and they see it work, and Jesse's response is, yes, magnets! But just, again, his character arc is almost as fascinating as Walter's in that he starts off in this, as just kind of a man-child in a lot of ways, not, just a small-time meth cook and dealer, and just he eventually winds up kind of desperately wanting to get out of the whole thing, but is, for various reasons, sucked back into it.
Yeah, I really enjoyed Aaron Paul's character arc, and for me, I don't think I really completely grasped where Jesse's going as a character until the finale. And it took me a really long time to watch this show. I mean, certainly not as long as if I had watched it as it happened on AMC, but it was available for binge watching on Netflix by the time I got around to Breaking Bad. And I watched the first season and a half, and I had to take a break because, midway through that second season is when they really start dealing with Walt's cancer and the treatment, and you see him take this severe turn for the worse, and you think, okay, geez, they're really pushing this character to the limit. Well, about that same time, my father, who was dealing with cancer, took a very serious downward turn, and it just got to be a little too lifelike for me. So I had to step back and take a break from it. And so when I came back in halfway through season 2 and started watching again, it was almost like a fresh slate and starting over and getting reacquainted with the characters, because it was about a 6-month break that I took. And so by the time we get to the finale of the series, this arc with Jesse has played out. Like you said, he tries to get out, he gets pulled back in, he desperately wants to be a good person and a good character, but all the sins of his past keep creeping up on him. And then we have the finale where Jesse gets to drive away. He gets in the car and he leaves and he's free, and he's just screaming with joy. And to me, that was maybe the most gratifying moment that I've ever seen on television, was to see Jesse Pinkman just screaming in hysterical laughter, driving away from everything, knowing that he is free. And I immediately thought back to all of the times that you saw Jesse in a car, whether it was with Walt or Mike, whoever it was. 99% of the time he was in the passenger seat. He looked bored. He looked trapped. And here, in the last moments of the show, we see Jesse just driving away from everything as fast as he can, and he is overjoyed by it. And I just thought, and what a great way to put a bow on this character.
Yeah, Jesse Pinkman was an odd character for me to kind of come around to. I think I had the same thing you did. I didn't understand all of where he was going initially. And in the first, there's a couple of episodes, and I forget them specifically, but there are some episodes wherein he is kind of swallowed up by Walter White, in that he's just kind of there. When he has scenes by himself, he's actually quite entertaining. In the first season, his interactions with his family, not too many of them, but just a few of them that I thought were wonderful. I still get a kick out of him trying to buy a plastic tote container for them to dissolve that guy's body in. And he's trying to figure out which one will fit, and he does so by trying to climb into it. But once you get to like seasons 3 and 4, he's got his own character, and he stands shoulder to shoulder with Bryan Cranston in every scene they share together, and they complement each other instead of one potentially eclipsing the other. Incidentally, that scene when, after Jesse has dissolved the body in the bathtub, and he tells Walt, well, what's the matter? We got a bathtub right upstairs. And then the ceiling collapses, and that glorious red goop comes pouring down, and Walt just looks at him and says, well, that'll happen for one thing. I mean, this show had some of the best kind of dark and situational humor that I've seen in a really long time. I mean, there was some genuinely funny stuff that went on. I mean, dark in the sense that there's plenty of horrific stuff going on as well. I mean, they dissolved this guy's body in a bathtub. But the fact that it all comes spilling down because he didn't bother getting a proper plastic tub that wouldn't react with the acid, I laughed. It was hilarious.
It was, and it sort of became Jesse's role for the first half of the show, was this guy with the best of intentions that couldn't help but mess things up. He couldn't get out of his own way. But we see Jesse develop a lot of heart through the show. And to me, my favorite moments with Jesse are the ones where he realizes that even in the moments where Walt is trying to be a friend and trying to guide him, it's all for manipulative purposes. And as much as Walter White is the focus of the show, he's not a good person. He's not a hero. It's easy to root for him, but he's not a good person. And Jesse realizes this, and he tries to start distancing himself. And that moment between Walt and Jesse, where Walt just tells him, I watched her die. Just the look that comes across Aaron Paul's face, that just perfect mix of rage and heartbreak. And all of a sudden you're like, Jesse, just hit him. Just punch him in the face. Be done. To me, that's one of my favorite interactions on the show, because Jesse starts to be his own person and refuse to be manipulated by anybody, for better or worse, even if it means the end of his life. Jesse is going to be Jesse and not going to be manipulated and strung along by anybody else. When he finally has enough of Walt, I really enjoy those moments.
Well, just as a bit of context, I mean, it was just an episode or two before that Jesse was having difficulty, and Walt's response was just to hug him, and he broke down a little bit. I mean, that's another great scene between those two. And, of course, Walt goes on. I mean, Walt's worried because he's worried about Jesse turning him into Hank, his brother-in-law, who works for the DEA. So, again, purely manipulative, but still just a good bit of interaction between the two. I mean, towards the end, I think my favorite scene between them was actually at the close of the first half of Season 5. Walt shows up to give Jesse all of his money, which, again, Walt's moral compass is very skewed, but it's there, and he's going to give Jesse the half of the money that he owes him. And he shows up, and they spend a moment or two reminiscing about the good old days in the RV, driving out in the desert. He was worried, Walt being scared to death that some good Samaritan is going to stop by when he's got an RV full of meth while Jesse's off getting gas. Walt then says, "I left you something." Walks out the door. Jesse opens the bag to find his money, collapses in relief, and then reveals that he was holding a small caliber pistol in one hand the entire time. I mean, it's a perfect microcosm of the way those two interact together, especially towards the end. There's no trust, but there's enough history that there's an odd bond.
Yeah, and to me, it's not to reference another show that we've mentioned earlier. To me, it's not entirely unlike the rapport that we see between House and Wilson, where Walt will befriend Jesse when it's beneficial to him, but spends most of his time driving him insane and manipulating him. And that's very much where House and Wilson were, that House would reach out to Wilson when he had nothing else. But by and large, he was very manipulative and took great pleasure in making Wilson's life a living hell because he didn't know how to form emotional bonds. And so there's, as much as they're friends, there's never a complete trust between them. So I thought the dynamic between Walt and Jesse was one of, I know I'm not ground here, it's not like my partner just making discoveries. The chemistry between Walt and Jesse is really one of the things that defines this show's greatness.
I absolutely agree. Now, I made this point, I believe, on our series finale wrap-up. I've made it in other places as well. The first two seasons of Breaking Bad are good. Something about the whole show kicks into overdrive at the end of 3 and especially into 4 with the introduction of Giancarlo Esposito playing Gustavo Fring. And I was so fascinated when I started watching the character of Gus Fring. And personally, I was so fascinated by it because I couldn't look at him and not see Anthony Hopkins as Hannibal Lecter for a variety of reasons. But we finally got kind of an opponent for Walt who was intellectually his equal, who was business savvy, and in many cases even more ruthless than he was. And Fring as his nemesis, the way those two played off each other, whether they're on screen together or they're playing a very dangerous game of chess, it's some of the best stuff. I mean, we got the neo-Nazis in Season 5 to kind of close things out, and you had Jesse Plemons as Scumbag Todd, who I was so happy when Jesse snapped his neck with the handcuffs in the finale. But
yeah.
They were clearly a step down in a lot of ways from the complexity that Fring brought to the table. So I'm curious as to how did you like that character? Because I don't think the whole thing would have worked nearly as well without what Giancarlo Esposito brought to the table.
No, what makes this dynamic, whether you're talking about James Bond and the super spy villain, or Superman and Brainiac, or Superman and Doomsday, or Batman and the Joker's elaborate and almost Goldbergish scheme to place him in danger. The value of an opponent, the ability to place the protagonist in a real sense of danger. And through Seasons 1 and 2, that was one case. It was something intangible, and it was something that was dealt with sort of off-screen with hints to the treatment and using it as a backdrop to the build of the emergence of the Heisenberg character. And so as Season 3 and 4 and 5 play out, we've moved past the lung cancer, and we have to have a very real antagonist towards Walter White. Not a metaphysical, not something that you have to think about and ponder and read between the lines on and try to guess where it's going. You need something tangible. And that's what Gus Fring provided, was this tangible sense of danger to Walter White's character, because Walter White's advantage in the whole cooking and dealing of methamphetamines was that he was smarter than everyone else that was doing it. He was dealing with people like Jesse Pinkman, and it wasn't a tremendous reach for him to outsmart them and create a better business model than what they had. In Gus Fring, he sees someone very much as equal, if not his better, because he's every bit as intelligent as Walter White. And as you said, even more ruthless, because he has the experience in this world that Walter White lacks. And so we go from cancer being the biggest threat to Walter White to this very real, very dark, very manipulative, very dangerous threat to Walter White's life. And it's an amazing, I think when you said this game of chess between them, it's amazing to watch, because Gus Fring never looks frustrated, always calm, always cool. And because of that, you see Walter White lose his cool. You see him become unsure. You see him become afraid. You see him become paranoid. And it creates this great dynamic, because that relationship starts to affect every relationship that Walter White has. And again, as with everything in this show, there's two sides to the relationship. Face-to-face, they're very professional and very cordial through clenched teeth to each other. Once they're separated and at a distance, it's very cutthroat and very ruthless. And I agree completely. Seasons 3 and 4 are not nearly as successful as they are, and the show doesn't take off as well as it does without Gus Fring.
Well, I brought this up, I think, when both on our series finale wrap-up and when I talked solo about Hannibal Lecter. For me, just there's something, and I don't know if this was deliberate on the part of Fring or the writers or anyone Esposito, or anyone like that, but everything he does, like you said, he never loses his cool. He's very, very still, and that's something that, again, I equate with Anthony Hopkins' portrayal of Hannibal Lecter, and actually I've heard him discuss on numerous occasions. He adopted that physical mannerism because he watched a lot of big cats. Not domesticated cats, mind you, lions, tigers, things of that nature. And when they're hunting, they're extraordinarily still. They don't even blink, which is one of the things from, especially Silence. You never see Hannibal Lecter blink, which is unnerving. But and everything is very calm and very slow and very deliberate. I mean, I think I have two favorite scenes when it comes to Gustavo Fring. The first one is when he first tries to have Walter killed, and Walt's response is to have his buddy Gabe killed by Jesse, and Gus's response to all of that is he very calmly changes out of his suit into a hazmat getup and then slits the throat of one of his employees with a box cutter, and then he very calmly washes his face off, redresses, and walks out. It's one of the most unnerving things in the world when you consider the violence of the act. And then probably my favorite is just the oddest thing when he is blown up. And you see that, and again, the room explodes, and you think, okay, the guy with the bell and Walt, they finally got him. And then he walks out. And there's just a moment when there's no way he survived that explosion. But at the same time, this is a character who you believe could, and then you pan around and he's got the Two-Face thing going on, and he straightens his tie before he collapses and finally expires. And it's just gloriously well done. Just little things that go with the character. I mean, I don't think Giancarlo Esposito has received nearly enough credit for when that show was at its best. It tended to involve him, and that's not a coincidence.
No, I agree with you. I'm glad you touched on that moment from the end of season 4, because to me, that is the best moment in television history. With a bullet, that the end of season 4, where he straightens his tie and falls over. It doesn't get better, because out of the entire show, I was very careful to read no spoilers. I wouldn't let anybody talk to me about the show. I avoided conversations about the show. I'd walk out of the room. I didn't read anything online. Just completely avoided it altogether. And then a random comment thread on Reddit in a conversation that had nothing to do with Breaking Bad. Someone mentions Gus Fring getting half of his head blown off at the end of season 4. And so it was the only spoiler that I had. I didn't know how it happened. I just knew that it happened. And even with the knowledge that it's coming, I was still picking my jaw up off the floor and just completely stunned at the end of it. And to me, if you can execute something that someone knows is going to happen and do it in such a way that it still catches them off guard, then you've done something pretty special creatively. To speak also to the scene that you referred to where he comes down into the lab, he slits the guy's throat with the box cutter, and he changes and walks out. To me, that may have been the most tense moment of the show. And I think unnerving is a good description of it, but it was very tense because watching, you don't know where this is going. And again, you see Walt completely come unglued there because he can't think the way Gus Fring thinks. And so the way Esposito played the role, the way he embraced that character and the life that he brought to it, remarkable job. I do think it's unfortunate that he was overshadowed. And not just him. I think Dean Norris was overshadowed a lot, too, by Aaron Paul and by Bryan Cranston.
Dean Norris was awesome in this. I mean, this is one of the things. The first few times I watched him on screen, I had an adverse reaction to the character. I don't tend to like, personally speaking, big jovial personalities, guys who will kind of punch you on the arm and then wrap you in a headlock and joke around the whole time. My personality tends to avert from them, so I was unsure about how I was going to like that. And as the whole series progresses, first of all, the fact that Hank Schrader is just a badass, and it takes forever for that to kind of come across, is so awesome. I mean, he takes out the two Mexican brothers by himself. He recovers from, again, paralyzing injury. Thankfully, it wasn't like an actual spinal cord severing, because you don't recover from that one, folks. But the fact that he looks straight up his final scene is equal parts inspiring and heartbreaking. When he looks up, first of all, when he looks up at Walt and says, Walt, you're the smartest guy I've ever known, but he made up his mind 20 minutes ago. And just looks at this Aryan waste of humanity and says, "Well, go ahead and do it." I mean, going out like that and knowing you're going out like that, that's a character that grew on me over the season and over the series, and it's a real shame that, again, a great performance of that, and he had a pretty good arc himself. I mean, let's not forget that.
Yeah, to me, what really entered me to is once you step back and you look at the show, it took me until about, honestly, probably about halfway through season 4 for me to completely realize this. He's the only character with any set of realistic morals on that show.
Odd how that finally...
He's the only person that if Breaking Bad were set in the world of Dungeons and Dragons, Hank Schrader and Hank Schrader alone is lawful good.
I'd say he's the only one with a good alignment at all.
Yeah, he's the only one that even approaches neutral. Like, Hank Schrader is the moral center of that show. And like you said, the arc that his character takes, it's so unfortunate that it gets overshadowed by everything that's going on in the world of Breaking Bad. But at the same time, you're dealing with a show that is just chock full of incredible performances, and unfortunately that means that some people are going to be overlooked.
Yeah, and if you're a fan of Dean Norris or Stephen King for that matter, he's doing some good things as Big Jim on, I think it's ABC's Under the Dome adaptation. I was sad. He's doing some good things. I was sad when I realized he was Big Jim because he winds up being like the supreme villain of everything, and I wanted to root for him, but what are you going to do? All right. Before we get into, there's a couple of other guys I wanted to mention quickly. I need to mention R.J. Mitty as another one of those performances that sadly is just overshadowed by so much of the other greatness. But playing Walt Jr., he's stuck in such an odd, the character, mind you, is stuck in such an odd predicament in that he knows nothing for 95% of the show. He does not understand what's going on. He doesn't know why his mom now hates his dad. He doesn't know why his dad's gone. He doesn't understand all the tension. There's all these things going on around him, and he's just in this odd kind of position that all he can do is react to what's in front of him. And then, of course, he finally does learn the truth, and his rant on the phone to Walt in the second to last episode is, it's a great bit of writing, and it's a phenomenal bit of delivery.
Yeah, I think probably it's easy to point to this again, not breaking new ground here, but you realize that R.J. Mitty actually had cerebral palsy, and a much less severe form than he portrayed on the show as Walt Jr., and I've worked with young men and women who have cerebral palsy at various jobs that I've had throughout my life, and it's a challenge. And he didn't ham it up. He didn't go over the top. The mannerisms that he portrayed as Walt Jr. with cerebral palsy were pretty spot on. It was pretty incredible, actually. And to learn that he actually had CP earlier in his life, and that he put himself through the torture of going back and relearning those mannerisms and those affectations in order to portray this character. I don't think you can ask for much more out of an actor. And just as much as Esposito and just as much as Norris, R.J. Mitty's performance probably didn't get as much credit as it truly deserved.
I mean, especially being initially at first the guy, theoretically Dean Norris is kind of the moral compass and whatnot, but R.J. Mitty would probably be the emotional center of the series, if only because Skylar White goes from kind of happy-go-lucky soccer mom to screeching howler monkey over the course of 5 seasons. Very well done, incidentally enough. You guys mentioned this before. Because Anna Gunn is not a screaming howler monkey. And to go from being, initially you can't help but kind of feel bad for Skylar, given her lack of knowledge and the circumstances she's placed in. And then once she understands everything and she turns into just the bane of every viewer's existence type of scenario. She won a couple of Emmys, especially those last 2 seasons. She did some great work. Let's see.
Just remarkably hateable. Just absolutely remarkably hateable over those last couple of seasons.
It was the oddest thing, too, because, again, she's sympathetic early on. You can't help but feel bad for her. And then she takes up with Ted Beneke. My other laugh-out-loud moment from the season that probably didn't deserve it in a lot of ways features Ted Beneke, wherein Saul, who I want to talk about Bob Odenkirk in just a second, but Saul Goodman's goons go to get him to sign off to pay off his IRS debt. That's all he's supposed to do with the money. Skylar gives him explicit instructions, you don't get to hurt him, or this will end badly for you. And they, all right, fine, we can intimidate him, we can do all this other stuff. And he tries to run from them within his own house at one point, and he trips on an area rug and slides headfirst into the the kitchen island, and breaks his neck.
That was
the most blackest of comedy errors. But my only response could have been to laugh at it, because it was, he wasn't going to be hurt. They couldn't have hurt him. He runs, and now he's paralyzed.
It was a desperately needed moment, because for several episodes leading up to that, everything just is so incredibly tense. There was no levity, there was no lightheartedness, there were no breaks, and then all of a sudden you have this guy who's just an incredible douchebag anyway.
Oh, God.
He was, if Jefferson from Married with Children were dropped into a drama, he'd be Ted Beneke.
That's true.
Just a smarmy idiot that you just completely unlikable. And here you see him careening head first into his kitchen island and snapping his neck. And you're right, it's very dark, it's very black comedy, but because of the build and all of the tension that had existed for several episodes up to that point, and the look on Jules' face, it's nothing but comedy gold. And I mentioned this on the Whiskey Rebellion when we were discussing Breaking Bad very briefly. Sort of wrap up on Anna Gunn's character here, Skylar. That last conversation she has with Walt, where he finally just cuts her off and said, I did it for me because I'm good at it. Again, Walter White ends up being just a reprehensible human being, but it put the biggest smile on my face for him to finally just tell her, no, I didn't do it for you. I did it for me because I was good at it. And good for you, Walt. You're getting ready to die, but good for you.
I loved that whole that whole final sequence wherein he rigs up the M60 in the trunk of his car.
Yeah.
And to anyone not familiar with how an M60 works, it would absolutely shoot through both the body of his car and that wall and go into all the neo-Nazis just fine.
Yeah, that's not something that's
weapon.
out of the range of reality. Yeah, that's big-time artillery. And what a great payoff on that. From the tease of just simply seeing it in the trunk of his car, however many episodes before that, to finally getting the payoff. What a great job by Vince Gilligan and crew to tease people with things like that and have the patience to pay it off at the appropriate time.
Yeah, they actually showed that, I believe, to start the final season. It opens with him.
Yeah.
It's either that or it's either the start of season 5 or it's actually like the actual start of season 5 when he's in the diner and he sees Jim and he meets with Jim Beaver. And then the only hint you get about it is you see him working on the oscillating arm and hooking it up to his keyless entry. And it's still just absolutely glorious. I wanted to talk briefly about Bob Odenkirk, who's getting his own spinoff, so yay him, as the crookedest of crooked lawyers in Saul Goodman. That had to be one of the best slimy lawyer characters on TV in quite some time, because he's got the charisma you expect out of a shice who advertises on TV and off the back of, bus stops. But when even if he's just talking with Walt, when he drops that persona and becomes slimy lawyer, it's just, I like that they're giving him his own series. I don't know how long it'll last, but he did such a great job as that character that if you were going to spin off anybody, I'm glad it was him.
Yeah, and I'm pretty excited to see some more of Mike Ehrmantraut through the show. Love Huel. Love seeing Huel just sort of mosey his way through gooning antics. But yeah, Bob Odenkirk.
You mentioned it earlier. He was comedy gold. That scene again with Beneke where the ginger-haired guy asks him, "So Huel, are you happy now?" And his response is, "Nobly."
Yeah, when he lays down on the money, just the little things that Huel does. He's great. He's one of my favorite parts. But Odenkirk was very much responsible for many of the tension breaks that you got in the show. They used Bob Odenkirk. They used Saul Goodman very well to sort of lighten the mood from time to time so that the show didn't become too heavy. 30 years ago, if Vince Gilligan were putting Breaking Bad together 30 years ago and Bob Odenkirk wasn't around to play that lawyer part, it goes to John Larroquette playing Dan Fielding in Night Court. It's they're cut from the same cloth, and it's such a great character, so enjoyable, and it's one of the characters where there are a lot of people on the show that do a lot of things in a very understated manner. Whether, like you mentioned, Gus Fring, very calm, very cool, very deliberate in his mannerisms, very understated. Then here you have Bob Odenkirk, who is boisterous and loud, and he is waving arms and screaming and panic and speaking in hyperbole. Just a fantastic job that I really think saved the show from being way too heavy at times.
Comedic breaks are just, even if it's not comedic, even if it's just lighter, those breaks
Right.
are really important, and they did use him very well. It occurs to me I could go through the entire cast of this show and find nothing really bad. Danny Trejo, who died. Is it just me, or is Danny Trejo the Mexican Sean Bean?
Yeah, he is. I was very disappointed when he died, but if you're going to die, what an exit. Your head is being marched across the desert on your namesake? Come on. What was the other one? I thought that was a nice surprise for the audience, too, because, for me, I wasn't entirely familiar with Mr. Esposito's work as an actor and the Gus Fring character and what he brought to the table and, what the magnitude of the cartel was. And everybody that's seen Danny Trejo knows that Danny Trejo plays the heavy. He's the guy you don't mess with. and all of a sudden, here's beheaded Danny Trejo. I think that really underscored the magnitude of what Walter White was getting into, because if you can kill Danny Trejo, you can do just about anything.
Yeah, and then, of course, that also leads into the awesomeness of Gus Fring poisoning the entire Mexican cartel. That's some, and just the other thing I loved about that, to kind of go back to Fring for just a second, the fact that his whole revenge plot laid out over, again, 5 or 6 years, longer than that actually. It was, the 80s when that flashback happened? So over a decade. He has plotted revenge for these people killing he referred to him as kind of like adopted brother. And he plotted revenge for over a decade for that one moment. And the fact that it worked, too. I mean, when he had Gus take the first shot of that tequila that was the poison, that was the poison delivery method, and he doesn't even hesitate. Of course, he goes and makes himself vomit immediately thereafter, and is still sick for a while. But that level of planning, it's uncanny, and it's just great. And the fact that he made a point of it, too, that's actually why he was... There are some people, they hold a grudge, and then they exact their vengeance in very good ways. The last one I wanted to briefly mention was Kristen Ritter as Jane, who we talked briefly about earlier. An odd character, in that I was not too sad to see the character go, because I liked Jesse by that point, and her getting him into heroin was just no es bueno. But her turn as Jane, it only lasts, about a season, I think is the entirety of her arc.
Yep.
But she manages to be just manipulative enough to be a little slimy, but at the same time have a kind of, not innocent quality, but, kind of the ethereal, better than the horrible world that we're viewing through the eyes of Walt and Jesse. And that makes her death not a tragedy, certainly, because, again, you overdose you're on heroin and then you choke to death on your own vomit. It happens. But her loss wound up sending so many ripples, especially, like you mentioned, Walt and Jesse, and the fact that her father accidentally crashed 2 airplanes together. Man, if you're an air traffic controller, take the bereavement time, people. Just take it all.
And the reason that, watching her gurgle and choke the reason that was so hard for me to watch, I can't speak for anybody else, is the whole time I'm sitting there thinking in my mind, save her for Jesse. Jesse can't lose anything else. And so for me, the reason I wanted that character to live was because of the impact that you knew it was going to have on Jesse, and send him further down the rabbit hole into just madness and despair and despondency. And so the most endearing part of her character, even as an addict and even as someone who wasn't necessarily good for Jesse, was she gave Jesse a reason to be better. And then that was taken away as Walter just watched. It really easy to hate Walt in that moment, even with the failings of Jane as a character.
I also have to say, watching Bryan Cranston's reaction to her choking to death is another great bit of acting from him. I've never seen someone choke to death on their own vomit, and if I couldn't do anything to stop it, I'd like to imagine I would react about as horrified as he was, the whole thing. And if I could stop it, I'd like to think I would, barring a few.
Yeah.
I'm not going to lie. There are a few people I would like to see choke to death on their own vomit, but there are also people like that in the world.
People. Yeah, I think we all have those people.
All right. Last question before we do plugs and wrap up. Gun to your head, metaphorically. You have a favorite episode?
I don't know if I could pick one, but with a gun to my head, I probably should. I guess, as easy as it is to say this, I would have to say the finale, just because of the conversation that we get between Walt and Skyler, and because of the glorious scene with the M60.
There's little better than watching neo-Nazi scum get blasted in half by a high-powered assault rifle.
Yeah, but again, to see the pure joy on Jesse Pinkman's face as he drives away from all of it, and then that perfect ending where Walt says goodbye to the lab before he just lays down and dies. that was very much a show that it would have been very, very easy for the finale not to live up to the expectations that the previous 5 seasons had created. And against all odds, Vince Gilligan and his creative team delivered. And that's such a rarity in today's television and film industry. The endings and the conclusions to things leave us wanting so very often. I don't think the conclusion of Breaking Bad could have been executed any better. And for that reason, that last episode is very near and dear to me. If I had to pick something beyond the series finale, I would probably go with the train robbery, just for the tension and the execution of the episode.
Oh, that's a good one. And, of course, we get the... Jesse Plemons may well have ruined his career by shooting that kid. There are certain... No. There are certain moments, movies, television, what have you, choosing to be on one side of that indelibly affects the remainder of your career in film, be it television or feature films. There's a reason Bruce Dern will never play a good guy.
Yeah.
It's because he shot John Wayne in the back 5 or 6 times. Incidentally, that's also the reason Ron Howard has a career.
Very much so.
And I mean, I assume you're aware of his role in The Shootist and the fact that character originally shoots John Wayne in the back again.
Yes.
And everyone involved knew that if Ron Howard shot and killed John Wayne in the back in his last movie ever, he'd never do anything else. And Jesse Plemons, you shot that poor kid. I mean, I knew people who had a fond affiliation with his name, courtesy of Friday Night Lights. You are now forever the guy who shot that poor kid on a dirt bike.
He played a sociopath a little too well, and he went from just looking like evil Matt Damon to holy cow, this guy's not okay. No,
and again, the fact that Jesse got to be the one that killed him in a very very violent and gruesome fashion was just. I felt so happy about that. I can't express. A feel-good moment for the ages, everybody. Jesse Plemons had his neck fractured. His trachea crushed. All right, that is going to wrap up our discussion here of Breaking Bad. Thank you all so very much for listening. I appreciate it. Thank you for telling your friends. If you liked this show, share it. Tell them. I don't have an advertising budget. I don't have sponsors. I don't have anything. I just have you guys out there listening. And thank you very much for doing so. You can choose any number of podcasts. Thank you for choosing ours. Mr. Napier, anything to plug, sir?
Yeah, we did a WrestleCast this week. The beginning and the end, a little rough. Middle had some good discussion in it, so check that out on iTunes, Stitcher, or over at www.casualheroes.com. You can follow us on Twitter.
Would that be your discussion Facebook. Of the worst Raw in a decade?
We didn't discuss a whole lot about that Raw. We sort of went down a lot of rabbit trails, and what we intended to talk about ended up not being what was talked about a lot of the time. We opened with a discussion of, we were going to open with a discussion of the fact that Tony Soprano is apparently not dead. Somehow that turned into a discussion, the character. Because the creator of the show stated in an interview that Tony Soprano did not die in the finale.
Good to know.
Yeah, puts a different spin on things. Somehow that turned into a discussion on The Wire, and from there we had to
with Mark, all things are about The Wire.
Yeah, and with Jed, all things are about The Wire as well. But somehow we shoehorned it back into wrestling for a while, and we ended with one of the worst lists we've done in a very long time. So check that out. I know I just gave it a glowing review. Also, a little personal project going on here. You can go over to Twitter at JCC Wrestling and check out Jewel City Championship Wrestling, some of the announcements we've made heading towards a professional wrestling show that I have become involved in the promotion of in Huntington, West Virginia on September 28th, 2014 at the Phil Klein Family YMCA. For anyone who may be listening to this in the West Virginia, Kentucky, or Ohio area, feel free to come check us out. We've got some great talent booked, including former TW, WWF, and TNA star Al Snow. Should be a good show. And we're donating up 2% of the proceeds, depending on the sponsorship dollars that we receive in advance, to both the Vinson Youth Football League and back to the Phil Klein Family YMCA to help support their basketball league that they run for the youth of Cabell County here in West Virginia. So the money you spend on tickets will go to a good cause. Should be a good night of family entertainment, and please feel free to check that out. Otherwise, you can find us, The Casual Heroes, on Twitter at The Casual Heroes. We're going to be doing a football podcast previewing the 2014-15 NFL season. And eventually, when we can get Jed and Neto and Dwayne all on the same page again, we'll get some movie podcasts going again. But yeah, just keep checking back with us, and you can find all of our stuff on iTunes, Stitcher, and the website. So plenty of options on ways to listen.
Alrighty. As for my plugs, my weekly column in the MMA Zone of 411mania.com was rendered completely useless this week. Why, you might ask? Well, I devoted 1,200 words, give or take, to breaking down the rematch between Renan Barão and TJ Dillashaw for the UFC Bantamweight Championship. Then Renan Barão decided it would be a good idea to cut 20 pounds in 3 days, and at weigh-in time was pulled for medical reason. UFC 177 is now yeah, who'd have thought, right? UFC 177 is now headlined by UFC Bantamweight champion TJ Dillashaw defending the title against Joe Soto, that famous tomato can. Oy. And guess what poor dumb bastard is covering UFC 177 live this Saturday for 411mania.com. I made light of my voodoo curse on the Ground and Pound show on Sunday, and it bit me in the ass by saying you won't get a single fight on this card worth watching. My life. So if you don't want to pay $60 for that card, and Lord knows no one is going to, it was borderline unwatchable with that main event. Now, give it the raspberry. I'll have live coverage at 411mania.com. Stop by, say hello, help me get through a night of fights. I'm going to loosely call them that. I mentioned it just a moment ago. Every Sunday, 8 p.m. Eastern, I host the 411 Ground and Pound radio show, a weekly look into the world of MMA. Myself and usually Jeff Harris. It's a call-in show. I give out the call-in information at the start of every show. This week we'll be reviewing UFC 177, previewing UFC Fight Night 50, and complaining about fighters pulling out of fights, because it's got to be a problem. I mentioned earlier there will be no show next Friday. I will be covering UFC Fight Night 50, which is on a Friday evening when I would be doing this, so we'll be taking a week off, and we'll come back, and we'll be tackling either WCW or ECW villains to jump back into the world of professional wrestling. And I plan on having a lot of fun doing it. You can check out all the fine shows here on the Radulich and Broadcasting Network. We're on iTunes, Stitcher, and Blog Talk. Subscribe, give us ratings, give us feedback. The featured show, I believe, is the Summer Blockbuster Wrap-Up series that I did with Mark Radulich. We had a look back at the Blockbuster season for the year of 2014. We were very happy about it. We gave glowing reviews to most things. I hated Transformers. I haven't seen The Amazing Spider-Man 2. And Mark and I debated Transformers at length. But if you want just a general overview, that's a good show to listen to. Be sure to check out Jason Teasley, Jesse Starcher, and Robert Cooper with From the Cheap Seats. They're going weekly. I will be doing some guest spots on The Long Road to Ruin in the near future. Sean Comer is taking a brief hiatus. Samer Cotty is going to be on talking about the Dark Knight trilogy in the next show. Then the show after that is myself. I'll be stepping in. We'll be talking about the Matrix trilogy. Then after that, I'll be back for Final Destination. Then in October, actually, Gavin's going to be on talking about Brendan Fraser's Mummy series, one of my favorites. I love that series. Not so much the third one, but I enjoy the first two.
Yeah, I like parts of it.
And Brendan Fraser does not age. It's scary.
No.
It's absolutely terrifying. He doesn't look any older. All right. I believe that's everything I have to plug. As far as the network here goes, I forgot the Metal Hammer of Doom. Every other Thursday, check out the Metal Hammer of Doom if you're a metalhead. Up this week, Baby Metal. It's Mark Radulich, Robert Cooper, and someone else who I forget. I don't know, but they're talking Baby Metal. So if you're a metalhead, show's great. Give it a listen. Every Wednesday, there's the Whiskey Rebellion, featuring Mark Radulich and Gavin Napier. It's news of the day, fun stuff, Florida man, whatever's going on in the world. They tend to tackle a few things. It's a lot of fun, including Gavin's Conspiracy Corner, which is always good, which is interesting. Whether you agree or disagree with the circumstances and the theories presented, they're worth listening to. And you do a great job presenting them.
I appreciate it, sir.
All right, that's it for us. So, for Gavin Napier, I am Robert Winfree, reminding you, I can't use my normal outro because I've got one that works for wrestling and works for superheroes. It doesn't work for Breaking Bad. All right, so without Heisenberg, Hank Schrader's just a loudmouth. That's what we're going with. I'll be back in a couple of weeks. I'll be back in a couple of weeks, everybody. I will see you then. Until then, again, remember, your heroes aren't that special without a great villain. I'll see you in a couple of weeks.
So say good night to the bad guy.